It's almost impossible to capture the beauty and complexity of reality in a computer-generated simulation. But some video games are getting pretty close. The Microsoft Flight Simulator games have been known for pushing the technological envelope ever since they debuted in the early 80s. The franchise is a pretty big deal for enthusiasts. The newest game is expected to pump an additional $2.6 billion into the PC hardware market over the next 3 years. One of the reasons the game's drawing such attention is its promise to simulate the entire world. Using satellite imagery, artificial intelligence, and a host of open source data, Microsoft Flight Simulator has generated a high-fidelity copy of the real world, with accurate mountains, rivers, and over 1.5 billion buildings. The game's ability to recreate our own world in a virtual space could make it a useful tool in real-world investigations and research, and the technology behind it has potential for so much more.
But even on my more modest gaming computer, I was just blown away how beautiful the world looked.
Giancarlo Fiorella is an open-source journalist for Bellingcat, an investigative outlet and newsy partner. He uses freely accessible tools like satellite imagery and flight tracking software to research and analyze events around the world. Fiorella first became interested in Microsoft Flight Simulator as a potential tool for helping with his investigations. The idea is that each virtual landmark in the game will roughly match up with its real-world counterpart across the entire globe, which could be useful in isolated areas that aren't captured well in other datasets.
What Microsoft Flight Simulator was promising was to potentially have, hundreds of millions, even billions of buildings all around the world, not just big cities, but even the most remote villages.
Fiorella quickly found that the simulated world diverged from the real one in some odd ways. Buildings that had been destroyed in real-world conflicts are still standing in the game. And while satellite images often blur out sensitive sites like military bases, the simulation is free to add in its own buildings to those places. The game's not quite accurate enough to be used as an analytic tool on its own. The simulated AI occasionally misjudges how tall buildings should be. And the game sometimes fails to capture the spirit of the buildings it is modeling. Take, for example, our national treasure, the Washington Office Park and Business Development Center.
For a game, it's cool because it's populating it with buildings, so that's good enough. But
Right.
For open source research and for something like geolocation, which requires really high precision, the game just doesn't have that kind of accuracy in its rendering of buildings.
Fiorella does think the software has potential when it comes to natural landscapes. The virtual renderings of mountains and lakes often contain more detail than commonly available satellite imagery. And the simulation's ability to even come close to mapping out the entire world provides a good picture of how far current technology has come and where it might head in the future.
Flight Simulator for Windows 95 puts you in the most realistic airplanes available on a PC.
Flight simulators have long set standards for visuals and physics simulations in video games. In some cases, these games served as introductions to the very idea of graphics and computing.
You can't really understand today's audiovisual culture or where it comes from without understanding the history of flight simulation.
Patrick Krogan is a media studies professor in England who specializes in the cultural impact of video games and simulations.
Often, early PCs would ship with a flight simulation game for free. And they did function a bit like that as kind of demonstrator models, if you like, or demonstrator examples of what audiovisual interface can do.
While the latest game still looks great visually, the series is really breaking ground in its use of satellite imagery and artificial intelligence. The simulator provides a good snapshot of what the global surveillance satellites and machine learning tech can accomplish.
I was really impressed by how the game is able to render like a copy of the world with real weather and lighting conditions. So it makes you think, what's the next Microsoft Flight Simulator going to look like?